Welcome back to the Hex Knight podcast. This is section 3 of our first episode on failure and how players and game masters can use failure to make for better gaming. Thanks again for listening.
But I also wonder almost if, and this might piss players off just as much, but if you say, okay, as you guys step into the factory hall, you realize that it is crawling with soldiers. You see blah, 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 laser man and silver spear taunting you. There are soldiers with weapons everywhere. Behind you, the doors close, and battle robots start striding in. You realize it's a trap, and you are hopelessly outgunned.
Totally.
You set it up if the outcome is established, you guys are going to get captured so we can do a cool escape from the evil, moon base, right? That's where we're going.
Yeah. Yeah, that seems awesome, but like you're saying, it's trying to convince the players that this is actually going to be cool. Trust me, this will be, it seems crappy now, but
I think a lot of that is going to come down to trust. You're going to have to win their trust that they will go with the idea because they trust that you're going to make it cool. Mm-hmm. Because if they have expected, even in a previous game, that if they get captured, that means they lose all their equipment, they get their ears cut off, and the characters all get turned into rabbits. They're not going to have that trust. You're going to have to kind of earn it with them, I think, before you can do that kind of story. Mm-hmm. They have to be willing to go along with it. And again, I think establishing it up front that this is a part of the world and a part of what happens, I think that can go a long way towards sort of diffusing the distrust, I think. I guess you can also ask the question of, if you don't trust your GM, why are you playing their game? But, a lot of people are in games that are, okay, but they're not great. A lot of players, aren't great. A lot of GMs aren't great. So sometimes you just kind of, you had a bad experience before. You played in games with GMs who were jerks about things and who would nitpick everything and who were trying to get you, and you're tired of that, and now you get into this game and that happens. You go into the warehouse where you were told by an NPC to go check something out, and now there's an infinite amount of killer robots. Oh my god, am I doing this again? I was just trying to get away from this, right? So yeah, honestly I think it's as much you got to win the trust as a GM, and you got to have established that either you're pulling for the characters, or worst case, the way I run really harsh simulation games these days, mm-hmm. that I set up the encounter as it should reasonably be for the location, and mm-hmm. if a fight breaks out or a challenge breaks out or a chase or something, we roll it out based on the rules or what I call at the moment, and the dice is what counts. That can go wrong or right. I'm not going to change the dice roll, but I am cheering for you to win. If you mm-hmm. get yourself into a really difficult struggle and you manage to get the lucky roll or you come up with a really cool plan, I'm going to cheer for you because that's cool. That doesn't mean I'm going to
for sure
downgrade the villains. And I think if you show that you're cheering for the players to win, I think that goes a long way towards building the trust that they're going to say, okay, if we're going to surrender to Captain Evil, he's not going to turn us all into dog food, right?
Right.
So I think it's a lot of homework from the GM to pull that up, unless you don't want to spoil the moment, right? You don't want to come out first and say, hey, this is going to happen in the campaign, and you guys are just going to have to go with it, right? You want it to be a cool moment, oh my god, I didn't realize Captain Evil had a moon base. That's the moment you want out of the group.
For sure.
So yeah, I think you're just gonna have to kind of work for it. Like you said, the GM works 4 times harder or 4 times more, and I think that's part of it. Some of the work is at the table. How well have you met the players? How well have you not triggered their fears, or how well have you met there when they want to do something cool or exciting? How often have you let them try to turn a failure into something cool? My power fails. Well, does that mean that the villain mocks and laughs at me and he skips an action? because he's underestimating me now. Like, hey, cool. Now, like, Mr. Speedo can, like, run and punch him in the face.
Sure.
As a side note,
I guess
Speedo.
Yeah.
He has a very specific set of powers.
Right. Jeez. I think that's a lot of like what we're trying to do with this podcast is just break certain paradigms that have just come down through like kind of breaking up our own expectations and experiences.
Yeah.
And for me, I feel like a lot of the time what brought me to like the role-playing table is just getting away from static narratives and interacting with people, having just seeing where things would go. So I like the idea of failure, and maybe that's coming from like an older kind of sword and sorcery based gaming concept.
People's expectations are a really big part of it, because you're going to get different actions. You're going to get people who say that, okay, I failed. Like, let's say you're trying to get through a door. You want to pick the lock, and you blow the dice. So you can... There's almost like different schools of thought, right? Like in a, I guess, true old school game, I'm going to sound kind of snooty here. You're going to say that, okay, well, that means you failed to pick the lock, and you can't do it. So you're going to have to come up with another...
You're stuck.
Yeah, get the barbarian to knock down the door, dig around, cast a tunnel spell, like do something. But if you're, I guess, more of a new school GM, you might say, okay, well, you failing the roll doesn't mean that you can't pick the lock, because of course you can. You're a thief, right? However, you couldn't pick it fast enough to do it before the guards show up. Right? So now...
What do you think about that?
I think it can be convenience. I think it can go both ways, because I think there's a tendency as a GM, especially if you're not a great GM, of wanting to like punish the player. So I think if you play it in a way that makes the game more interesting, like I think the difference is if you say, okay, I'm picking the lock, and you roll and you almost make it. I think to make it interesting, you tell the player, hey, while you're working on it, the lock turns out to be a little more difficult than you thought. You can hear like the patrol guards making their rounds, and they're a room over. You have time to try again, but if you fail, they're going to catch you red-handed. Now the player has a choice to make about it. They can go for it. I have a pretty good skill. It should work the second time around, right? Or they can be cautious about it and like, okay, you know what? We're going to come back later. Or we're going to find another solution, or we're going to just abandon this stupid door. I think I don't think you want to, like we mentioned up front, I don't think you need to punish the player for an unlucky dice roll, unless that's just part of like the simulation that happens, right? Conversely, you might be in a situation where there are no guards. It's an abandoned ruin. One of the rooms is locked still, and we've made our way this far. We're picking the lock, and why am I rolling? I have all the time in the world. I have a bag of lockpicks. If not, I have a barbarian friend with an axe who has anger issues and has nothing better to do. There's nothing in the ruin that's alive or dead, so our noise won't attract anybody. Should we be rolling at all here? Or should we just say, all right, it takes like an hour, and you get the log open, now you can investigate. So again, like, are we like justifying the dice roll? And is the thing that happens when we roll actually interesting?
Right. And that goes back to being stuck within the mechanics. Are you playing through a set of mechanics just because you think you have to?
Right. Or are we rolling just because, like everyone has been in a game where somebody fails to do something and they ask, like, well, can I try again? And as a GM, you don't want to say yes to that unless there's like a cost. Okay, so you guys have 2 hours to get through this door before like the goblins come back. Okay, so now there's a bit of a cost to it. If it takes me 15 minutes, and I failed twice before I succeed, we've like now the time is a resource, and we've burned half an hour. Now we don't have as much time to search the room, or knocking down the door is going to make a racket, and there's a risk to that. But if there's no risk and there's no consequence, then like that kind of falls back to like, is this the interesting part of your game? And I'm gonna guess that the answer is nah.
Right.
Is the player trained, or is the character trained to do this thing? Well, just let him do it. Like sometimes it's okay too. Like routine tasks is a good way of letting the player feel cool. Like, hey, your character is a trained soldier. He recognizes that these weapons are made by the Imperium of blah, blah, blah.
Right.
Like that lets him feel cool without having to roll dice for it. I think that's, and it's easy to forget. I forget that all the time, but it's an easy way of letting the player just like, oh yeah, of course my character can do that.
Otherwise, you're just like stuck at the classic scruffy, wet behind the ears teenager who's like suddenly caught up in an adventure, and that's cool. Well, you're starting at level 1, and if you're playing the game really mechanically, then like it kind of sucks. Like you're just stuck, and you're going to be doing like fetch quests for like 3 or 4 sessions because that's what your character can do. And it's like, like it's one thing. Like I think it's valuable to talk to the players about that. Like, okay, this is how this game and the setting work. Like, do you really want to go through that?
Right. Or do we want to, I think it's again the same sort of question restated, like what is your game about? Is your game about like street urchins scrabbling for survival? Then that's perfect. But if your game is supposed to be about like defending the kingdom from an extra dimensional threat, maybe you need either to start with more powerful characters, or you need a game that just assumes that you're powerful. Like it's the difference between playing like, I don't know, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, where your character has a 30% chance of succeeding, and playing like Stormbringer, where you can start with a sword skill of 150%. Like I'm so good, I don't roll to succeed. I roll to see if it's critical or not.
Right.
Like in we've been recently playing Pendragon, and if you're a knight on horseback and you're charging and you're like inflamed by passion, so you can easily get a skill of like 30 on a d20 that you're trying to because the game isn't about the guy who can barely swing a sword. The game is about doing cool knight stuff. So let's start the characters as cool knights. Like the default weapon skill, if you follow what the book suggests, is a 15 that you're trying to roll equal less than d20.
Nice.
That just is the starting point, because that's what the characters need to be able to live and adventure in a dangerous world. But again, like, is that probably the answer to, do we want to play characters who will be knights in 20 years, or do we want to play characters who are knights now? I think a lot of people will want to do the latter. So, skip the, like, there's this idea that you should always start as, like, nobodies, because that's what we do, but there's no reason you need to do that.
Right. That's just something that's always bugged me. I feel like that comes out of like D&D is the center of what tabletop gaming is. So we're always starting at level 1 and grinding through all that.
It's actually a thing that I think like White Wolf sort of tackled well. Like if your starting point for the game is like you're an immortal vampire, now what? Then you are kind of forced out of that comfort zone of like, well, you start being a nobody that nobody likes. Like, no, like my character starts off. I made a starting character. He has like a retinue of people. He has like mind-controlled minions, and he can throw cards. Like, like let's, like let's not do this just because it's what we've always done, and nobody has like stopped and asked the question of, do we even want to?
Right.
Like I'm fine with some squabbling in the dirt gaming, but it doesn't fit every campaign, and it doesn't fit every mood. Sometimes you just want to throw a car.
Yeah. Be the superhero.
I know. I think the like lessons to take away from this meandering conversation is that the type of game you're playing matters an awful lot, and you should stop playing with Steve. Because, God damn it, Steve, all of those bad things in the campaign is all you.
This concludes episode 1 of the Hex Knight podcast. We thank everyone for listening, and I'm sure Ivan would appreciate it even more if you could take a moment to check out Nordic Weasel games over at gamerevolt.com. Thanks again.